In March 1959, a 20-year-old Oxford student named Neil Moss entered Peak Cavern in Derbyshire, England, with hopes of exploring uncharted areas. But what began as an exciting adventure soon turned into one of the most tragic events in caving history. After descending into a narrow, deep shaft, Neil became trapped 1,000 feet below the surface. The rescuers tried everything. Ropes snapped, volunteers risked their lives, and more than 200 people, including the RAF and Royal Navy, joined the rescue effort, setting off one of the largest rescue attempts the UK had ever seen. But after 35 long hours, Moss lost consciousness due to the buildup of carbon dioxide. He never woke up. Neil's body was never recovered. His father made the heartbreaking decision to leave him where he was, fearing that further attempts to retrieve him could cost more lives. What could have been a story of discovery turned into one of great loss, forever marking a dark chapter in the history of caving. Neil Moss was not just an ordinary 20-year-old student, he was someone with a genuine thirst for adventure. In the late 1950s, the world of caving was seen as exciting and dangerous, drawing in young explorers eager to push the boundaries of the unknown. Neil Moss, studying at Oxford, was part of a small group of British Speleological Association cavers who had set their sights on the famous Peak Cavern in Derbyshire, a cave with centuries of history behind it. Caving, or spelunking, was a popular but highly risky hobby at the time. Equipment was basic, safety protocols were minimal, and communication systems inside caves were almost non-existent. However, this didn't stop Neil Moss and other adventurers from venturing deep into the earth. On March 22, 1959, Neil, along with a small group of cavers, entered Peak Cavern, known for its large cave entrance and narrow, twisting passageways. At that time, Peak Cavern was one of the deepest cave systems in the UK, and it required skill and bravery to explore its hidden passages. Neil's group aimed to explore a newly discovered fissure that had piqued the interest of experienced cavers. The exact goal was to go further into the cave than anyone else had, especially down a shaft that was said to lead to uncharted areas. It's important to understand the mindset of explorers like Neil Moss at that time. Exploration was seen as a noble pursuit, one that could lead to groundbreaking discoveries. Neil, being young and enthusiastic, saw this trip as his chance to be part of something special. This fissure they aimed to explore wasn't just any narrow passage, it was part of a larger cave system that many thought held untapped potential. Neil volunteered to go first. He was an experienced caver, confident in his skills. This was no small feat. Descending into unknown territory always came with risks. The descent began normally, but as Neil went deeper into the shaft, things started to take a troubling turn. Peak Cavern is not an easy cave to navigate. Unlike many modern caves where explorers now have advanced equipment, Neil's descent was done with simple gear, including a ladder made of light materials and basic ropes. As Neil went deeper into the shaft, he found himself in increasingly tight spaces. The passage twisted and turned, becoming narrower with every meter. Moss continued downward, navigating these tight spots with difficulty but without giving up. At around 1,000 feet 300 meters deep, Neil found himself wedged in a space that was simply too tight to move in. He tried to push past a boulder that blocked his way, but he couldn't make it budge. This boulder turned out to be the key obstacle that trapped him. With no way to go down further and no room to turn around, Neil was stuck. To make things worse, the position he was trapped in meant that he couldn't use his legs to help pull himself up. His arms were also pressed against the sides of the shaft, making it impossible to pull himself out with his upper body strength. It's at this point that Neil called out to his fellow cavers for help. Realizing that Neil was trapped, the group quickly devised a plan to pull him out using a rope. They lowered down a line for Neil to grab onto, but this wasn't a strong rescue rope, just a light hand line, which was not designed for heavy lifting. Neil tried to tie himself to the rope, but as his companions pulled, the rope snapped under the weight. This happened several times, and each time the rope broke, Neil became more trapped. By this time, panic may have started setting in. Being stuck in a narrow, dark, and damp cave would cause anxiety in anyone. But for Neil, the biggest danger wasn't just being stuck, it was the air around him. Carbon dioxide began to build up in the tight, airless space, a problem that would soon become fatal. Caves, especially deep ones, often have poor air circulation. In Neil's case, the narrow shaft meant that there was little room for fresh air to reach him. The carbon dioxide from his own breathing began to accumulate, and without any fresh oxygen coming in, the air became harder to breathe. This dangerous buildup of gas would eventually make it impossible for Neil to remain conscious, but at this early stage, he was still alert and calling for help. The caving team's efforts to pull Neil out were not working. As panic spread among the group, they quickly realized that they needed more help. It was now a race against time, and every moment that passed meant less breathable air for Neil. As Neil Moss's situation worsened, word quickly spread, not just among the small group of cavers but to the wider community and beyond. By the night of March 22, 1959, the rescue operation had begun to escalate dramatically. Peak Cavern, already a known site for caving expeditions, was now at the center of one of the most complex cave rescues in history. When Neil's companions realized that they couldn't free him on their own, they immediately called for outside help. At first, local cavers and rescue volunteers arrived at the scene, but as the news spread, more specialized help began to pour in. Over the next few hours, more than 200 volunteers, including members of the RAF, the Royal Navy, and other experienced caving groups, arrived at Peak Cavern. The scene outside the cave was chaotic. Media outlets had picked up the story, and crowds of onlookers gathered near the entrance. While the situation inside was growing more desperate, those on the outside were hopeful that the rescuers would be able to reach Neil in time. The atmosphere was tense, as every hour that passed meant that Neil was facing even greater risks due to the carbon dioxide buildup in the narrow shaft. One of the major challenges of the rescue operation was the narrowness of the shaft where Neil was trapped. It was clear from the beginning that only the smallest and most agile cavers would be able to reach him. This led to a call for specialist cavers, including some of the most experienced cave explorers in the country. One of the first responders was June Bailey, a young but skilled caver who was small enough to fit into the tight space where Neil was stuck. Bailey's efforts were nothing short of heroic. She spent 6 hours trying to free Neil from the narrow shaft, navigating the treacherous conditions and the buildup of carbon dioxide that was making the situation even more dangerous. But despite her best efforts, she was forced to retreat, driven back by the foul air that made it impossible to continue. Another experienced caver, Bob Leakey, also made an attempt to reach Neil. Leakey was a veteran of many cave rescues and had a reputation for being calm under pressure. However, even he was unable to get close enough to Neil to provide any real assistance. The narrow shaft, combined with the increasing concentration of dangerous gases, made it impossible for rescuers to work effectively. The passage was so tight that even getting basic supplies like fresh air or additional ropes to Neil was proving to be a monumental challenge. To fully understand why the rescue operation was so difficult, it's important to consider the state of cave rescue techniques in the 1950s. Unlike today, when cavers have access to advanced technology and safety equipment, rescuers in 1959 were working with minimal resources. Ropes, pulleys, and basic communication tools were the extent of what they had at their disposal. Another major issue was the lack of air circulation within the cave. The narrow shaft where Neil was trapped was essentially a closed-off pocket, and the longer he stayed there, the more carbon dioxide built up. This lack of ventilation was a significant problem for both Neil and the rescuers. Even those who tried to reach him were struggling to breathe after just a few minutes in the shaft. Efforts to pull Neil out using ropes had already failed several times. The ropes that were being used were too light for the job, and they snapped under the strain. Each time the rope snapped, Neil's situation grew worse. He was now unable to move, and the rescuers couldn't get close enough to help him tie a stronger rope around himself. By this point, Neil was no longer able to assist in his own rescue. The carbon dioxide buildup was making him weaker, and he eventually lost consciousness. Once Neil was unconscious, the rescuers knew that time was running out. Without his help, it would be nearly impossible to pull him out, and the risk of further collapse or entrapment increased with every passing hour. Despite the heroic efforts of everyone involved, it became clear by the morning of March 24, 1959, that the situation was dire. Rescuers continued their attempts to reach Neil, but it was becoming obvious that he had likely succumbed to the lack of oxygen. Neil's father, who had been at the scene since the beginning of the rescue operation, made a difficult decision. He requested that the rescue efforts be halted and that his son's body be left in the cave. This decision wasn't made lightly. Neil's father understood the risks that further rescue attempts posed to the other cavers. The conditions in the cave were worsening, and it was becoming clear that trying to retrieve Neil's body could result in even more loss of life. With a heavy heart, Neil's father asked that his son be allowed to rest in peace where he had fallen. This was a pivotal moment in the story. The rescuers had given everything they had, and the community had rallied around the Moss family in their time of need. But sometimes, Despite the best efforts, the situation is simply too dangerous. The cave was sealed off, and Neil Moss's body remains in Moss Chamber to this day. Neil Moss's tragic death sent shockwaves through the caving community, but it also had a profound impact on cave rescue techniques and safety protocols in the UK. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, there was a lot of public outcry about the dangers of caving. Many questioned why such a dangerous activity was allowed to continue without better safety measures in place. The media coverage of Neil's death was widespread. Newspapers around the world, from Europe to Australia to the United States, reported on the story, often with sensationalized headlines about the baffling tragedy. In some ways, the media attention helped shine a light on the dangers of caving, but it also led to a lot of misunderstandings about what had actually happened. Some newspapers even reported that Neil had been successfully rescued, leading to confusion and false hope for those following the story. One of the most immediate changes that came about as a result of Neil's death was the reorganization of the Derbyshire Cave Rescue Organisation (DCRO). Prior to the Moss incident, cave rescues were largely uncoordinated, with volunteers working independently or in small groups. The lack of a unified strategy during the Neil Moss rescue had highlighted the need for better coordination and communication during cave rescues. In the years that followed, the DCRO and other cave rescue organizations around the UK began to implement new procedures to ensure that future rescue operations would be more efficient and safer for both the rescuers and those being rescued. These changes included the use of better equipment, improved communication systems, and more rigorous safety protocols for those venturing into dangerous cave systems.